Our delegation would like to submit to the Assembly a very short resolution.
There are more of us than ever before. But it's always a question of quality as against quantity in this life.
People want to take over your job. I'm sure there's some guys who'd like to take over you. The guys in the back are making less money than you. So and they think you're better than you, probably.
Sure.
So,
and they probably are.
Philly says, what do you guys do for training in the summertime? I said, oh, we sit around and drink beer and swim and fool around a little bit.
I'd like to know when and where I said that I invited Mr. Trudeau into bed with us.
Hello and welcome to the podcast of the Red Ensign. This is a special episode in which we will look at, rather than doing a general discussion of Canadian politics, we're going to look at a particular issue, trace it through the history of Canadian politics, and try to get a deeper understanding of the issue and the general lessons that it can provide to us, political analysis. In this episode, we're going to look at the fiscal history of Canada in the post-war era, and particularly the soft bankruptcy of Canada in the 90s and early 2000s. One of the critiques which is often leveled at elite theory, the view that the politics of any given entity are controlled generally by an organized minority, varying sizes, varying conditions, is that it casts elites in control of governments as though they're omnipotent. An important corrective to this, what I would call kind of low IQ version of the elite theory perspective, is to understand the hard constraints that surround the governance of any nation. One of those hard constraints is the total resources available to the government at any given time, whether those resources be military resources, whether those resources be material resources. They provide a kind of hard jacket within which the elite can operate policy. And if they attempt to operate outside that jacket, there are hard consequences, whether those consequences are an actual shortage of resources, whether those consequences are a famine, whether those consequences are a military confrontation with a rival. There are consequences to not dealing with reality for elites of various kinds, and they limit the scope of political action that any given elite is capable of. So when you see what I would call kind of the conspiracy sphere of the online right talk about things like Agenda 2030 or net zero or kind of climate lockdowns, an important piece of the puzzle to understanding the evidence presented in that world is to understand the hard limits that exist around our society. And a case study in this is to look at the soft bankruptcy of Canada in the 90s. So we're going to look at it. We're going to kind of trace this history, and hopefully there will be some lessons here that can be taken away for the present political moment. I also think that this is one of the most important pieces of Canadian history to kind of understand how the country got to where it is. And you'll see as we come to the latter half of this discussion, how this dynamic shapes the politics of the current moment. So how did this begin? Well, in the period beginning during the Second World War and ending in the kind of mid to latter 60s, Canadian society was completely reinvented. And it was reinvented by the introduction of a series of very important government programs. I've got a list here, some to pull out here: the Unemployment Insurance Act, the Old Age Security Canada Pension, the Medical Services Act that would eventually become the modern Canadian healthcare program, and the Canada Assistance Plan, which became the the collection of welfare systems that exist today were all introduced in this period, and they were introduced with the intent of creating a cradle to grave bond of care between the government of Canada and the people that it governed. That from the day you were born to the day that you died, the government of Canada had a duty of care over you that it would exercise through a series of government agencies administered by the various provinces, whether that's medical care, whether that's education, whether that's employment insurance for when you were fired, um, whether that was welfare benefits if you were injured or mentally incompetent or whatever. Um, it was a total rewriting of the social contract between the Canadian elite and the people that it governed. And I think before we get into the details of what this looked like, or get into the details of how this was financed and the problems it ran into, it's worth kind of getting inside the psychology of the people who were writing this at the time. So here is John P. Robarts, who was Premier of Ontario in the 60s, talking about one of the capstone pieces of this legislation, one incidentally which never came to pass, universal basic income.
I don't think it is necessary that one should work in order to be kept alive in our society. And with the increase in our means of production, it may be that we are now sensing the first beginnings of a situation where our ability to produce may be such that there may not be productive work for everybody in our society. In which case, I doubt that any of us would take the attitude that if you don't work, you don't get paid, or if you don't work, there's no place for you in society, as it may be. To relate this to the whole question of a guaranteed minimum wage, or guaranteed annual income, or negative income tax, however you choose to describe it, I gather that this matter has been pretty thoroughly discussed, and probably you want to know what my reaction to it all is in order that you may compare that with certain reactions that have been given to you by other people who've been here. We referred to this in the budget that was presented in the Ontario legislature in 1969 as something that we thought should be examined very carefully. My own approach to it is, I think it offers an infinite number of possibilities, which all should be carefully investigated.
There's a lot in that clip, but it's worth really taking stock of the predicating assumptions that went into this era of policy management. I pulled the Robarts clip. I could have pulled a half a dozen others from this era. The elites who lived in Canada in the 50s and 60s thought that they were entering into a post-scarcity society, a society where nuclear energy would provide limitless, virtually free energy, and where automation would transform the workplace to produce virtually infinite goods at very, very low prices because of the concomitant low energy prices. They believed that as a consequence of this incredible productive capacity, that there would be a large class of people for whom no productive work could be found, and that society had a duty to kind of care for these people and positively engage them. This is the predicate for many of the welfare programs that you see on the screen at the moment. This is what the elites at the time were thinking. You may recognize echoes of this discourse in the current AI discourse, where current elites broadly believe that whole classes of labor will be made obsolete in the coming 10 or 20 years, and are considering their options for how to form a society for that world. Now, with that kind of in the back of our mind, let's look at how this spending actually kind of came into being. So if we look at spending per person in inflation-adjusted dollars via federal programs, there's a number of things that really stick out. First, during the period of the introduction of the welfare state between 1940 and 1966, spending per person actually doesn't really escalate all that much. You see an initial bump after the demobilization after the war under Louis Saint Laurent, but for a long period of time, there's a degree of stability in spending, even though a lot of the very fundamental programs that would drive Canadian government spending were introduced in this period. It's actually in the later government of Lester B. Pearson and the government of Pierre Trudeau, where per person spending at the federal level really transformed. Now there's a whole video video or essay or piece available to discuss why this happened, not when the acts were passed, but on a significant delay after the acts were passed. But this is an important kind of lesson about the way in which laws and their consequences often aren't properly there's a big difference between the impact of a law the day after it's passed and the impact of a law in the long term. Anyways, over the period of Trudeau's government, Joe Clark's government, Trudeau's second government, per person spending in Canada radically escalated. And it escalated much faster than tax revenue escalated, which caused, on a delayed basis, a radical increase in Canada's public debt. So Canada's federal public debt peaked locally. There's problems today that are a whole different discussion. Actually, in 1994, so on quite a delayed basis, we're talking about the consequences of legislation that was passed between 1940 and 1966, hitting their hard constraints in 1994, 30 plus years later. And when we talk about Canada's soft bankruptcy, we're really talking about this local maximum here. And we're talking about how it was dealt with. Now, debt as a percent of GDP is a pretty raw metric. But underneath the covers, there were some really serious problems that demanded a reaction from the Canadian elite. The first of these problems, and the most significant of these problems, was the collapse of the Canadian dollar. So between 1977 and 1985, the Canadian dollar lost roughly 30% of its value relative to the US dollar. And in the late 90s, actually in 2001, the Canadian dollar reached its ultimate low at roughly 60 cents US. The sort of instigating issue that drove the Canadian government to react is the gradual inability to sell Canadian debt in Canadian dollars. So as long as a government is able to sell debt in a currency it controls, that it can print more of, that it can manipulate interest rates of, that government is in control of their financial situation. The minute that a government has to sell debt denominated in some other currency, in this case US dollars, the government passes out of control over its own conduct and passes into a situation where it has to react to outside stimuli. And you can see in the beginning in the late 80s, if you follow Canadian politics, this kind of contraction of the vision of the Canadian government. Talk a little bit more about that but as we go on. Look at this from a different lens. If we look here at a chart of spending on interest as a fraction of Canadian spending, as a fraction of income taxes, you can see that beginning in the late 70s and peaking in the late 80s, the government of Canada got into a situation where it could no longer finance the debt that it was carrying. So if you think about income tax is a fundamental element of the revenue line of government. Um, you had a situation where almost the entire revenue line of government was consumed by interest that had to be paid on the debt, and interest rates could not be manipulated because the currency was getting out of control. This is a government running into the hard constraint of lack of resources. For Canada, going to a kind of autarkic economy where you turn inwards is not really an option because it's an export economy, because it's a climate where you have to have imports at certain times of the year, because it's deeply bonded to the United States and in this period certainly can't act independently. It's politically impossible. You can't. There's no way to ignore this problem, and so you have the government of Canada forced to react to it in very uncomfortable ways in the period. And you can see as they react, you can see as this peaks out through the late 90s and they finally start to deal with it in the late 90s, both through a combination of interest rates declining and well, I mean, what ultimately rescues them is the Iraq War and the increase in oil prices, and therefore the increase in the revenue line, which finally you can see actually when you look at the dollar, it's actually the Iraq War that saves the Canadian government more than any other one thing. But if you go back through the political history here and you look at the late government of uh, Jean Chrétien, Paul Martin, the early government of Stephen Harper, they're absolutely consumed by the issue of managing the deficit. And they've got a number of reasons for this. We talked about the hard constraints of government spending, but equally, you can see when you look at the purchasing power parity value of the Canadian dollar, you can see the suffering that was being imposed on the Canadian people during this period. So this is purchasing power parity of the Canadian dollar versus the US dollar. So you can see in the late 90s and early 2000s, there's like an upwards of 20% discount for the purchasing power of the Canadian dollar in terms of real goods compared to the US dollar at a time where Canadian wages were lower in nominal terms than US wages. This profound gap in standard of living uh, caused a kind of self-reinforcing crisis. Uh, at the time, there were unending streams of articles about the brain drain, the number of highly talented Canadians who left the country in order to go to the US because of the better wages there and the better standards of living there. And so um, you saw a hard constraint in the bond market, you saw a hard constraint in the currency market, but you also saw this kind of soft constraint where um, the political control, where the value of the country as an asset to the elites who politically controlled it was rapidly declining because of the brain drain problem, uh, driven by the standard of living difference between a country that they couldn't separate themselves from. Right, there's no North Korea solution for Canada at this time. And you can see it also socially. So beginning in So this chart looks at the number of days lost to strikes over a 40-year period. And you can see in the late 80s and early 90s, an incredible amount of labor unrest in the private sector, driven by this huge discount in standard of living in Canada versus the US. This is another way of rendering the political problem that the Canadian elite were in this period. And then you can see intensifying through the late 90s and early 2000s, this very large number of days lost due to strikes in the public sector, reflecting the difficult choices that were being made by the Canadian government to try to get control of their spending. And then magically in the mid 2000s, all this goes away because of the oil revenue. But you can see that until they kind of got bailed out, Canada is in this kind of very, very intractable position where the various power blocks in the country are fighting it out and nobody's happy. Maybe the most artistic way to describe this is to show a little clip of our of one of my favorite prime ministers from this period.
He came face to face with one of the demonstrators. Suddenly, Chrétien took the man by the back of the neck. His other hand was over the protester's mouth. He pushed him aside. Seconds later, another protester approached the prime minister. Chrétien knocked over the bullhorn that was in his hands. This was all over in a matter of seconds. The prime minister grabbing a protester by the back of the neck and pushing him aside. The RCMP pushed the protester on the ground.
How different from Mr. Robarts and his duty of care expressed over the entire population, no matter how humble. You have Jean Chrétien physically assaulting a member of a crowd who is there explicitly to kind of be hostile to him and make his life miserable. This kind of hostile relationship between the Canadian elite and, in this case, one of their own client groups, is it's a reflection of how, when the elite kind of run into the hard constraints of their limits of resources, they may not lose power right away, but they have this very uncomfortable position that they run into. And this is what Canadian politics was like all through the 90s and the early 2000s. You can see it in the voter turnout measures. You can see a kind of hopelessness setting in the early 90s, where voter turnouts go to historic lows. You have minority governments in the early 2000s, and you have this permanent set of political grievances that the country gets locked into. In this period, you also see a bit of a different strategy employed by, well, really the Chrétien and Martin governments to transfer this obligation from the federal government to the provincial government, and transfer the hostility that they were running into from the federal government to the provincial government. You can see here, looking at net of transfer spending from the various levels of government, you can see federal spending basically flatlines from the early 90s into the early 2000s. And during that period, you see a radical acceleration, particularly in the second half of that period, in provincial and local spending. Now, there's a number of implications to this. One of the implications is a radical transfer of power away from the Canadian federal government to the provincial and local governments. So Canada today, in this position where the actual check on the Carney government today is really Alberta separatism and Quebec separatism. This is a product of this crisis and the requirement to respond to this crisis by divesting the federal government of responsibilities that it could no longer deal with. And so the very fixed, the very strong elite networks that exist regionally in Canada exist in substantial part because the Canadian government was unable to finance its mechanisms to undermine them. The elite dynamics that exist today in Canadian politics are a consequence of the relative decline in power of the federal government compared to these regional elite networks, as a consequence of really the mismanagement of Trudeau Sr. and all of the kind of downstream consequences of it. A huge amount of what elite politics looks like today is formed by this failure. So what can we kind of learn from this in retrospect? Well, I mean, we've seen how the Canadian government was forced to respond and to a hard constraint of reality. So no, elites are not omnipotent. They exist in kind of this straitjacket of the limits of their power imposed by reality. You can see how those choices and particularly the choice to manage the situation by a combination of reliance on oil revenues and downloading responsibility to the province has created permanent limitations to the power of the federal government in the country, or permanent, very long-term limitations to the power of the federal government in the country. You can see how that's reshaped Canadian politics in the years since. As we go into a world where several governments, including the US government, are facing bond crises for the first time in many, many years, it's worth just remembering this history, understanding how it's shaped us as a people locally, understanding how it's likely, and considering how it's likely to reshape global politics, as well as probably Canadian politics again, as we face a renewed round of decline in standard of living, a renewed round of decline in the value of the dollar, a renewed round of peak spending per person by the federal government, and a renewed round of constraints on the federal government's ability to implement the things that they may or may not want to implement, and very likely a consequent new settlement, new normal for Canadian politics. It's People look at Canadian politics and look at the kind of ideological lock that the progressives have had on it for a very long time. But the hard underlying realities that drive governance in this country are changing, and they're changing rapidly. And we need to understand this moment in view of that reality. Thanks for your time and attention. And I hope you enjoyed this format. Let me know below whether this is something you'd like to see again on other issues, or whether you'd like me to go back to the kind of dialogue format that the show is typically presented in. We'll probably do a little bit of both, I think.
Canada originally was put together by two groups of people who didn't have much in common but didn't want to be American.
The line just popped into my head. A bunch of the boys was a-whooping it up. And there I got my start.
We have had a flag. Flags can be changed. But flags cannot be imposed, the sacred symbols of a people's hopes and aspirations, by the simple, capricious, personal choice of a Prime Minister of Canada.
I have watched this country for half of my life from abroad, and we have turned complacency into just that, a national sport.
I am resolutely opposed to all innovation, all change, but I am determined to understand what's happening. I don't choose just to sit and let the juggernaut roll over me.